It was Christmas Eve, 1994, in the small, snow-choked town of Asheville, Massachusetts. Midnight Mass had begun just after 11:30 p.m. at St. Aurelius, a stone church nearly 2 centuries old, known for its ornate choir loft and freezing pews. Families in heavy coats packed the candlelit sanctuary, shoulders brushing, voices rising together in song. At the front of the church, standing beneath the towering crucifix, was Father Thomas Bell, 54 years old, soft-spoken, beloved by the town. That night, he wore deep purple vestments and carried the weight of both scripture and seasonal expectation. Witnesses say the first half of Mass proceeded without anything unusual. Hymns were sung, scripture read. At approximately 12:17 a.m., just before communion, Father Bell stepped away from the altar and turned down the side corridor leading to the sacristy. Parishioners assumed he was preparing the Eucharist, as he often did. The choir continued singing. But 5 minutes passed, then 7, then 12. The choir leader began signaling to the organist to keep going. People in the front rows started whispering. When one of the altar boys peeked around the corner and came back pale, the whispering turned to worry. 2 ushers went after him. They searched the sacristy, then the vestry, then the hallway behind the baptismal font. But Father Bell was nowhere to be found. Not in the basement, not in the locked broom closet at the end of the corridor. It wasn't until someone announced that he wasn't in the building at all that panic began to spread. Some thought he'd collapsed, others assumed a medical emergency. But no one had heard anything. No footsteps, no crash, no cry for help. Nothing. By 1 a.m., the entire church had emptied into the cold night. Dozens of townspeople, still dressed for Mass, were scouring the surrounding cemetery with flashlights. A handful walked the street behind the rectory, assuming Father Bell had perhaps gotten confused or disoriented and wandered off. But this was a man who'd served St. Aurelius for over 20 years. He knew every inch of the church. He wasn't sick. He wasn't suffering from memory problems. And there were no signs of foul play. When police arrived at 1:26 a.m., they conducted a full sweep of the building. They found Father Bell's coat still hanging in the rectory hallway, his car parked, locked, with snow already piling up on the windshield. No fresh footprints led away from the church. The doors were locked from the inside, windows intact. The corridor where he was last seen led nowhere, a simple hallway with a closet at the end and solid stone walls on either side. He'd walked into that corridor and vanished. Within hours, the state police were called. Search dogs were brought in. The grounds were canvassed in tighter and tighter grids. Nothing. What troubled investigators most was the timeline. There were over 60 people inside the church that night. Several had a clear line of sight to the altar and side hallway. And yet no one, not one person, saw Father Bell exit the church or enter any room or speak to anyone. He didn't run. He wasn't pulled away. He didn't fall through the floor. It was like the moment he turned that corner, he ceased to exist. News outlets picked up the story within 24 hours. "Priest disappears mid-Mass," one headline read. Some reporters hinted at a scandal. Others leaned toward the supernatural. But the town itself leaned toward confusion and grief. Father Bell wasn't just a priest. He'd been a counselor, a wedding officiant, a grief companion. He'd presided over funerals, christenings, soup drives, and Christmas pageants for decades. And now, in the middle of the holiest night of the year, he was simply gone. In the weeks that followed, rumors swirled. Some said he'd gone into hiding after threatening to expose something within the church. Others insisted he'd been targeted. But none of those theories could explain the logistics. No doors opened, no windows shattered. The organ played. The choir sang. He stepped into a corridor and vanished. The altar boy who last saw him said only one thing before he and his family moved away. He went down. When asked what he meant, the boy wouldn't elaborate. By February, the investigation had stalled. Nobody, no blood, no belongings. The church cooperated fully but could offer no useful answers. Father Bell's personal effects remained untouched in the rectory for months. Eventually, the room was cleaned out. His vestments boxed, his sermons are archived. The corridor where he disappeared was never used again. But in Asheville, time didn't smooth over the edges of the mystery. Each Christmas Eve, Parishioners left an empty chair at the front of the sanctuary. Every few years, someone new would revisit the case, but it never led anywhere. People learned to live with the question. They accepted the gap. 31 years later, a restoration crew broke through the wall behind that corridor and found the staircase. By sunrise, Christmas morning in Asheville felt different. The frost still clung to the gravestones, and the church roof glistened silver in the light, but the peace the town had known for decades felt fractured. Police cruisers remained outside St. Aurelius, their lights silent but pulsing. The church had been cleared, taped off, the choir loft empty. The pews are cold, the altar bare. Father Thomas Bell was still missing. The sheriff's department began a full sweep just after 6 a.m. Sheriff Carl Menz, a lifelong Asheville resident who'd known Father Bell since childhood, led the search himself. Deputies started in the obvious places: the rectory, the basement furnace room, the sacristy. Then came the crawl spaces, the attic, the crypt under the altar. By mid-morning, it was clear. There was no trace of the priest anywhere inside the church. Not so much as a footprint. The corridor where he was last seen was one of the oldest parts of the building, a narrow hallway of aging stone leading to a dead-end utility closet. There were no side doors, no windows, no vents large enough for a person to squeeze through. The closet door was locked from the outside, with a rusted latch that hadn't been moved in years. Inside, cleaning supplies, a ladder, and a single burned-out bulb. Dust blanketed everything. Detectives found no blood, no scuff marks, no drag lines. It was as if Father Bell had walked into that corridor and vanished mid-stride. Several parishioners confirmed they'd seen him head that way. One usher said he heard the priest humming a hymn as he disappeared down the hall. But no one ever heard a door open, no footsteps returning, no voices raised. There was no sound at all. Attention turned to the church's surveillance system. 2 cameras were installed at the rear entrance and near the nave. Basic units, grainy resolution. But oddly, neither recorded anything after 11:46 p.m. Both feeds went dark for the remainder of the night. Technicians couldn't explain it. The system hadn't lost power. There was no evidence of tampering. It simply stopped. A timestamp and then nothing. Outside, search crews spread out across the snow-covered grounds. They combed the cemetery behind the church, poked through the trees beyond the perimeter fence, and checked the side alley behind the rectory. No footprints led away from the church. There was no break in the fence line, no indication that anyone had climbed out or walked into the woods. A nearby drainage ditch was probed. The river was checked. Still, nothing. Dogs were brought in by early afternoon, a pair of German shepherds trained for live scent and cadaver detection. They picked up a faint trail near the altar, but lost it entirely halfway down the corridor where Father Bell had last been seen. One dog reportedly began whining at the closet door, but did not signal a hit. The hallway itself seemed like a dead zone, scentless, silent, and untouched. By evening, Sheriff Menz authorized full interviews with everyone who had attended the Mass. One by one, parishioners were questioned at the town hall. They gave similar accounts. Nothing had seemed strange. The Mass was beautiful. Father Bell was in good spirits. The choir sang through the entire communion segment, assuming the priest would reappear. No one noticed the moment when things went wrong. The most unsettling part wasn't just that a man had vanished. It was that he'd done so inside a space with limited exits, surrounded by over 60 people, and in complete silence. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, no frantic rush, just a smooth disappearance, like air leaking from a sealed jar. Within 48 hours, rumors began to circulate. Some claimed there were tunnels under the church, relics of an older building that had once stood on the same site. Others whispered about a hidden chamber, something sealed up after a fire back in the 1800s. Local teens had passed around stories for years about secret doors and a ghost monk that lived under the floorboards, but none of that had ever been taken seriously. Sheriff Menz requested architectural blueprints from the diocese archives, hoping to rule out the tunnel theory. The plans they received were incomplete and confusing. Some sections had been redrawn over older pages. There were entire rooms that appeared in older versions but were missing in later ones. Hallways shifted. Measurements didn't match. The corridor where Father Bell disappeared had originally been marked as a passageway, not a dead end. But by the 1971 blueprint, it was labeled "Storage Sealed." As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something else. In 1963, a different priest, Father Alton Reyes, had requested an emergency transfer from St. Aurelius, citing unexplained disturbances and a suffocating presence during night services. No official complaint had been filed. His letter was quietly buried in a personnel file. Theories began to stack up. Has Father Bell found something hidden behind the closet? A crawl space? A bricked-off shaft? Or had someone lured him out and back in another way? But how could they? Unseen, unheard, with no open doors and no physical trace. Over the next few weeks, the disappearance became a point of fascination. The local paper published a feature titled "The Corridor That Swallowed a Man." Television crews arrived, interviewing townspeople who speculated wildly. Was it foul play, a cover-up, something darker? But without evidence, the case stalled. Father Bell was declared missing, presumed dead 6 months later. The church reopened its doors to a subdued congregation. The corridor remained sealed and unused, cordoned off by a makeshift partition. It became something parishioners avoided without fully realizing why. Years passed, the whispers never stopped, and each time someone brought up that Christmas Eve, they always landed on the same question. How could someone disappear inside a stone building with no exit, no blood, and no sound? It wasn't until 31 years later, during routine restoration, that someone finally cracked through that very wall and found the thing no one had been ready to see. In the days following Father Bell's disappearance, the investigation shifted from logistics to motive. There were no signs of forced entry or abduction, no ransom notes, no demands, and most disturbingly, no physical evidence that anyone else had been involved at all. So investigators began asking a harder question. Had Father Bell simply walked away? To those who knew him, the suggestion was impossible. He wasn't a flight risk. He wasn't depressed. He'd never once indicated he was planning to leave. His bank accounts remained untouched. His passport sat expired in a drawer. His medications, minimal, were still in the medicine cabinet at the rectory. But the longer the case dragged without any new leads, the more it seemed like the only rational explanation left. The idea gained quiet traction. If no one had taken him, maybe he'd gone on his own. The theory, however, came with complications. Father Bell was no ordinary priest. For years, he'd quietly pushed back against the diocesan hierarchy. He'd spoken in sermons, carefully, never directly, about institutional failures and the weight of silence. Parishioners remembered his words. "Not all wounds bleed," he once said during a homily on forgiveness. Months before his disappearance, he had sent a private letter to his regional bishop expressing concern over how the church had handled certain misconduct allegations in the state. He urged transparency. The letter was described internally as inappropriate and reckless, though no formal action had been taken against him, at least on paper. Some believed he was becoming a problem. Others thought he was simply worn down. But either way, it opened a door to interpretation. If he feared retaliation, maybe he had staged his own vanishing. If he felt his warnings were being ignored, perhaps this was his final statement, disappearing into myth as a form of protest. It wasn't unheard of. Priests had walked away before, but never like this. Then there was the matter of the altar boy. His name was Mason Dillard. I'm 12 years old. He had served Mass that night alongside 2 other boys and was the last person confirmed to have seen Father Bell. During his initial interview with detectives, Mason was pale and withdrawn. He said Father Bell had nodded to him before stepping into the corridor. Then he added something else, a single sentence that at the time was quietly dismissed. "I saw him go down." When asked what he meant, Mason didn't explain. He simply repeated the words. He went down, like under. Investigators asked if he meant stairs or if the priest had tripped or collapsed. Mason shook his head. No, he just went. It sounded surreal, metaphorical. The kind of image a scared child might invent to explain something he didn't understand. Officers assumed it was confusion or stress, a grieving mind trying to make sense of the impossible. The statement was noted in the report, but not pursued further. After all, the corridor ended in a stone wall. There was no down, no stairs, no trap door, just a closet and 30 feet of hallway. 3 weeks later, the Dillard family moved. No notice, no goodbyes. Their house sold fast. Records showed they relocated out of state. They didn't leave a forwarding address. The boy, now out of reach, was never re-interviewed. This didn't stop speculation. Some parishioners believed Mason had seen something he shouldn't. Others thought he was protecting someone. But the sheriff's department made no formal effort to chase the family. They had no reason to. No evidence of foul play, and nothing to tie Mason to any wrongdoing. His words remained a curiosity, a strange, unsettling footnote in a case growing colder by the day. Meanwhile, attention turned back to the church itself. Journalists began digging into Father Bell's history. In seminary, he'd been outspoken, deeply devout but unafraid to question doctrine. Former classmates described him as troubled by silence. In his early years as a priest, he had written essays under a pseudonym for an underground Catholic journal that challenged the church's reluctance to confront abuse. While those writings never went public, word of them circulated. A former nun who had left the order in the late 80s came forward to say Father Bell once told her he feared that parts of the church were rotting from beneath. It was a phrase that stuck. And now, in the absence of any other explanation, people started wondering if he'd been silenced. Not by force, but by fear. The voluntary disappearance theory gained traction with investigators at the state level. They believed the pressure, the weight of what he knew, may have driven Father Bell to vanish, to hide, or worse. But critics of this theory pointed out what still hadn't been answered. If he ran, why leave everything behind? Why disappear in front of 60 witnesses in a locked building? Why walk into a corridor with no exit? And why has no one seen him since? Even if he had chosen to leave, the logistics made no sense. By the 6-month mark, the case was classified as open, no leads. The file grew thinner. Tips stopped coming in. Christmas passed again. The altar remained unlit, and Father Bell became more story than man. But some in Asheville never bought the theories. They remembered the boy's words, the corridor, the odd air that seemed to settle over that part of the church. And over the years, a new theory began to form, not of murder or escape, but of something older, buried, forgotten, something that, in time, would no longer stay hidden. In the years that followed Father Bell's disappearance, the corridor where he was last seen became something people didn't talk about directly. It stayed closed, not by police order, but by quiet, mutual agreement. The church never officially blocked access, not at first, but a velvet rope was strung across the entrance, then a folding table, then a heavy bookcase. By the end of the decade, the wall had been sealed with plaster and paint. No announcement, no ceremony, just gone. Despite the case being technically open, it had long since slipped into silence. There were no new leads, no further investigation, no task force. The file sat in the back office of the Asheville Sheriff's Department, collecting dust. Occasionally, a new detective would pull it out, scan the report, shake their head, and file it back where it came from. There wasn't anything to chase. The last known location was a sealed hallway inside a locked building. The last sighting came from a child who hadn't been seen since 1995. Every now and then, someone would suggest reopening the wall, scanning beneath the floor. But the diocese declined. There was no budget, no legal grounds, and more importantly, no appetite. Still, St. Aurelius remained open. Masses were held weekly. Weddings returned. Funerals resumed. But Christmas Eve always felt different. Midnight Mass continued year after year, but something had shifted. Families still came. Carols were still sung. But the air hung heavier. The candlelight felt dimmer. A sense of absence settled into the walls. There was always one seat left empty near the front row, not marked, not discussed, but never filled. Over the decades, small things kept the story alive. In 2004, a visiting organist from Boston mentioned hearing faint singing from behind the sanctuary during rehearsal, soft, low, and entirely out of sync with what she was playing. When the staff checked, the corridor was still sealed. No one else had heard anything. She chalked it up to nerves, but she didn't return the following year. In 2011, a maintenance worker named Craig Dalton filed a request to have one of the basement storage rooms closed off, citing what he described as air that doesn't move. He told a colleague he felt pressure in his ears every time he stood near the old boiler, as if something were pressing in from all sides. That request never made it past the parish office, but Dalton left the job a month later. He never gave a formal reason. Then came Father Mark Trenton. He arrived in 2016, assigned by the diocese to take over after the retirement of the long-serving priest who had quietly maintained the rhythms of the church in Father Bell's absence. Father Mark was younger, more skeptical, and less willing to entertain the superstitions that had lingered in the community for years. In his first sermon, he made light of the church's haunted hallway, calling it a legend with a bad ending. But within his first year, he changed. He stopped holding evening services in the sanctuary. He started requesting meetings at parishioners' homes instead of in his office. And in the summer of 2018, he wrote a letter to the bishop requesting immediate reassignment. The reason was short. Something's wrong with the basement air. I've felt it. I believe Father Bell never left. The letter was quietly processed. Father Mark was moved to a parish in Vermont. He never publicly commented on his time in Asheville again. By the time the pandemic hit in 2020, attendance at St. Aurelius had dwindled. Most of the older congregation had passed or relocated. A new generation had grown up hearing stories, not just of the priest who vanished, but of the odd creaks, the low hums, the cold that pooled near the floorboards no matter how hard the furnace ran. It became less of a church and more of a relic. Midnight Mass was still held, but fewer came each year. No one sat in the front pew anymore. And though the choir still rehearsed in the loft, they always left the building by 9 p.m. No exceptions. Outside the church, the town changed. Asheville's population shrank, businesses closed, the grocery store downsized, the town paper folded. But the church remained, a stone sentinel with secrets buried beneath it. Every few years, someone would write a blog post. A YouTube video would circulate with low-resolution pictures of the altar and headlines like "Mass Disappearance in Massachusetts" or "The Priest Who Walked Through Walls." None of them had real sources. None brought new evidence. But they kept the name alive. Keeps people wondering. The corridor remained sealed. The stone behind the plaster never touched. No one had the stomach to reopen it, not after so many years, not with the way the walls seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't until 2025, when a historical preservation group received a state grant to begin restoring several of Asheville's oldest structures, that the wall would be disturbed. On a routine day in early spring, a construction team removed a loose panel of plaster behind the sacristy. One man tapped the wall with a gloved hand and felt the echo of a hollow space behind it. The corridor had not been removed. It had been covered. What they found behind the wall wasn't just a hallway. It was the entrance to something that had never been drawn on any blueprint, something that had waited beneath the church for centuries. Something no one was ready to uncover, not after 31 Christmases without him. In February 2025, more than 3 decades after Father Bell vanished, the state of Massachusetts awarded a preservation grant to a handful of historically significant buildings scattered across aging towns. Among them was St. Aurelius Church in Asheville. The structure had stood for nearly 180 years, and despite a slow decline in congregation size, it remained one of the most architecturally intact pre-Civil War churches in the region. Its vaulted ceiling, thick stonework, and intricate hand-carved altar were considered irreplaceable. The grant would allow for weatherproofing, structural reinforcement, and, most importantly, the careful restoration of several internal walls that had been patched haphazardly over the years, one of which included the now legendary corridor. The construction crew came from Boston. They'd been briefed on the local history, but only casually. The disappearance of Father Bell wasn't mentioned in official documentation. To them, it was just another job. On the morning of March 11th, a crew of 3 workers began clearing plaster from the southern inner wall, a section that had been sealed sometime in the mid-90s. Their supervisor believed the space once led to an old vestry. The goal was to restore it for community tours. The workers used chisels, hammers, and a single electric rotary tool. They expected drywall and aging lath behind the paint. What they found instead stopped them cold. At first, it was just a sound, a hollow thunk where solid stone should have answered back. One worker, a man named Aaron Levy, leaned his ear to the wall and tapped again. Hollow. He widened the area with a chisel. Dust poured out. Beneath the outer plaster wasn't stone or framing, but a second layer of brick, thin, uneven, and clearly older. Bricks that had been mortared hastily, not for structural support, but to conceal something. The crew paused work and called the site supervisor, who arrived and authorized exploratory removal. By mid-afternoon, they'd uncovered a breach roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall. Behind it was not a vestry. It was a corridor, dark, choked with cobwebs and sloping downward in a way no one expected. The crew refused to go further. The air was thick and stale, carrying a smell none of them could place. Not mold, not rot, something older. The parish office was notified immediately. Within hours, the diocese was alerted. When a structural consultant reviewed the space the following morning, he confirmed what stunned everyone. This stairwell, descending in a tight spiral beneath the church, appeared on no existing blueprints, neither architectural nor historical. It was absent from original documents, renovations, even fire escape maps. It had simply never been recorded. By the following week, a full forensic team from the state arrived. Ashevale's Sheriff's Department reopened Father Bell's case file and issued a formal request for access. Work ceased indefinitely. The sealed corridor, untouched since 1995, was now the subject of a full structural excavation. Investigators entered carefully. The stairs were narrow, covered in a thick layer of dust, their stone edges worn but stable. Initial tests dated some of the mortar to at least the late 1800s, possibly earlier. The design suggested ecclesiastical construction, but not in line with the known architecture of St. Aurelius. It was older, deeper in both time and on earth. No lighting had been installed, no wiring. This place had never been meant for modern use. One of the first forensic officers to descend was Janice Kroll, a 20-year veteran of cold case investigations. She later described the air as unnaturally still, like stepping into a sealed jar. The deeper they went, the more the temperature dropped, though there was no airflow to account for it. The passage spiraled twice before opening into a cramped landing. From there, another narrow passage led straight, stone on both sides, and disappeared into black. The team spent days mapping just that first portion. No one had expected to find anything. For 31 years, the theory of hidden tunnels had been a local myth, but this was no myth. It was real. And it had been under the church the entire time. The discovery made local headlines, then state, then national. Journalists descended on Ashevale. News vans parked outside the church gates. Residents who'd grown up with the story now stood at the fence line, watching investigators carry in equipment, lights, cameras. What had once been a rumor, a priest swallowed by stone, had become a live investigation. The bishop's office released a short statement expressing cooperation and shared interest in uncovering the truth. They denied any knowledge of hidden architecture. But privately, several retired clergy were contacted, including a former maintenance coordinator who had worked at St. Aurelius from 1962 to 1977. He claimed, off record, that once, long ago, he'd heard whispers about a bricked-over passage, a rumor passed down through priests. But no one had ever found it. No one wanted to. That man passed away less than a month later. Back inside the corridor, deeper scans revealed that the stairwell descended another 20 vertical feet before reaching what appeared to be a walled chamber. Sound tests returned odd results. The stone responded inconsistently to vibration. Some parts echoed, others seemed to absorb noise entirely. A specialist described it as a dead spot in the ground. As the days passed, something else surfaced, a memory buried in the original case file. The statement from the altar boy, Mason Dillard, was long dismissed. "I saw him go down," he had said, "down under." The words had seemed vague at the time, symbolic, but now, with this staircase exposed, the statement no longer felt metaphorical. It felt literal. By the end of March, ground-penetrating radar confirmed multiple chambers beneath the sanctuary, some natural, some carved. The layout was inconsistent with modern construction, and somewhere below the nave, beneath the oldest part of the altar, investigators marked what they believed to be a sealed inner room. It was only a matter of time before they opened it, and whatever was waiting behind that wall, it hadn't seen light in over 100 years. 2 weeks after the stairwell behind the plaster wall was discovered, a joint operation was launched. Law enforcement, forensic anthropologists, and a team of historical archaeologists from Boston College were granted full access beneath St. Aurelius. The corridor that had stunned the town now served as the entry point into what appeared to be an undocumented catacomb system beneath the church, one that no map, blueprint, or diocesan record had ever acknowledged. The stonework bore little resemblance to the main structure above. Where the church was carefully crafted, the passages below were crude, narrow, uneven, hand-hewn in some places, collapsing in others. The team dated the earliest parts of the tunnel system to the 1600s, nearly 2 centuries before the current building had been constructed. It appeared the foundations of the original chapel, long assumed destroyed in a fire, had not only survived but had been built over. The deeper the team moved, the clearer it became that there was no single corridor. It was a branching network. Some tunnels twisted tightly, forcing investigators to crawl. Others opened into alcoves cut directly into the rock, each barely large enough to kneel in. Many of the walls were coated in mineral deposits in the remains of wax long since hardened. One chamber contained a stack of rotted wood, likely benches, another a collapsed stone table. The air was cold and still, far colder than it should have been, given the shallow depth. The silence underground was complete. Radios failed. Signal strength dropped within minutes of descent. Communication had to be managed with relays. Movement was slow and deliberate. 3 days into the exploration, the team uncovered human remains. The first were discovered along a narrow side passage, fragments of bone scattered across the dirt floor. At first glance, they appeared jumbled, but closer examination revealed something stranger. The bones had been arranged, not as a burial, not in a pile, but placed deliberately in a circular pattern with a rusted iron crucifix embedded at the center. Forensic analysis confirmed what the team suspected. The remains were at least 300 years old, likely victims of plague, possibly early settlers or missionaries. But this was no traditional burial site. There were no caskets, no markers, no identification of any kind, just bones, dust, and stone. Deeper in, another set of remains was found slumped in a niche, this time partially mummified, the dry, cold air having preserved strips of cloth and brittle skin. The figure appeared to have died in a kneeling position, arms crossed, face turned away. The positioning was unnatural, like someone had been left there mid-prayer and never moved again. None of these remains matched Father Bell. Their clothing, bone structure, and decomposition patterns predated the 20th century by centuries. Still, every step forward stirred new questions. Why had the church never documented this? Why had the passages been sealed? The breakthrough came on the 5th day, at the end of a long, twisting tunnel that veered east, well beyond the boundaries of any known foundation. A searcher spotted what he thought was cloth sticking out from a mound of debris. It was barely visible, buried under several inches of dust and fallen rubble. Carefully, the debris was cleared by hand. What emerged was a narrow piece of faded purple fabric, old but intact, with gold trim along the edge. A clerical stole. Initial identification was hesitant. Many priests wore stoles. But when photos were shown to members of the original investigation, including the retired sacristan from 1994 who had dressed Father Bell for the Christmas Eve Mass, the match was immediate. He remembered the stitching on the trim, the faded cross near the edge. It was the same stole Father Bell had worn the night he disappeared. Its placement was disturbing. It wasn't folded or set aside like a garment removed intentionally. It had been caught beneath fallen stone, as if it had been torn or dropped in a struggle. But there was no blood, nobody, just fabric. Further down the tunnel, the passage narrowed into a low archway that ended in a stone wall, blocked completely. A collapsed section maybe, or something deliberately sealed. Ground-penetrating radar, when lowered from above days later, would show a small chamber on the other side. Just large enough for one person to stand in. Teams worked to stabilize the surrounding structure, but there was hesitation. The deeper they went, the more irregular the stonework became. Some areas felt almost intentionally confusing. Dead ends that looped back, alcoves that narrowed and rejoined themselves, air pockets that shouldn't have existed. The oldest archaeologist on the team described the space as architecturally illogical. Theories began to emerge, that the tunnels were part of an early religious movement, that the settlers had used them during outbreaks or persecution. But those theories didn't explain the placement of the remains, or the fact that none of it had ever been documented, or how Father Bell's stole had ended up in the farthest tunnel, in a passage not found in any record or oral tradition. The town was watching. So was the church. So was the media. And back at the Asheville Sheriff's Department, detectives reopened the evidence file once again. Only now they had something new to add. Not a body. Not yet. But something that proved Father Bell had been down there, that he hadn't walked out, that he hadn't disappeared voluntarily. Something had brought him below the sanctuary that night. And now, after 31 years of silence, that something was starting to come into focus. They had reached what they thought was the end. Past the corridor where Father Bell's stole had been discovered, investigators had marked the tunnel as sealed. Beyond it was stone, solid and cold. It wasn't until one of the archaeologists examined the curvature of the wall that they noticed something strange. A shallow, rounded impression buried beneath mineral buildup, too symmetrical to be natural. It looked like the faint outline of an arch. The stonework here didn't match the tunnel around it. The team requested permission to excavate a section roughly 5 feet across. The process took 2 days. Behind the outer layer of stone was a second barrier, this time a crude stone door, sealed tightly and reinforced from the inside. What they found behind it made seasoned investigators stop in their tracks. It was a room roughly 9 feet wide, 10 feet long. No windows, no ventilation. The walls were made of the same rough-cut stone as the tunnel, but darker, soot-coated in some places. The air was dead, stale in a way that clung to the skin. The door had been barricaded from the inside using 2 warped pew planks, remnants of the same kind used in the original St. Aurelius Chapel, and iron rods rusted through but still wedged against the doorframe. The barricade had not been forced from outside, it had been placed intentionally. Whatever had happened in this room had been meant to stay sealed. Inside, there were no bodies, no blood, no obvious remains. But what they did find was worse in its own way. Near the back wall was a single candle, burned down to a nub, surrounded by melted wax that had pooled and hardened into the uneven stone floor. Along the walls, investigators noted scratch marks, long, shallow, erratic. Some clustered in frenzied vertical strokes, others more deliberate. There were deep grooves etched with either metal or bone. Forensics would later confirm they had been made by human fingernails. And then, in the center of the room, lying in a slight depression in the dirt, was a leather-bound journal. The front cover had deteriorated, but the initials remained, carved in clean, decisive strokes. T. Bell. Gloved hands lifted the book. Its leather was stiff, dry, curled inward at the edges. But the pages inside, remarkably, had survived. There were 27 of them, each filled front and back with increasingly chaotic handwriting. The first pages were legible, the last bordered on unintelligible scrawl. The journal began on Christmas Eve, 1994. The first entry was calm, measured. Father Bell described hearing faint singing coming from behind the broom closet after stepping away from the altar that night. He believed it was the choir rehearsing in the wrong location. But the singing was strange, off-key, slow, coming from below. He investigated. Behind the closet, he found a panel, and behind that, an opening. He followed the sound. He believed, in his words, something beneath the church was asking to be seen. The second entry shifted. He described a tunnel, cold and narrow, lit only by his candle. He said he felt drawn. Those prayers were being whispered to him through the stone. He began writing about the buried ones, figures he claimed had been left by the original priests. His tone alternated between awe and dread. He returned to the room, he said, because he believed a truth was waiting. By the fourth entry, his tone had fractured. He wrote that he no longer trusted the walls, that the air moved even when he didn't. He said he heard breathing, not from the tunnel, from behind the stone itself. He lit the last candle. He slept in the corner. The darkness, he wrote, was not passive. From there, the handwriting began to break down. Phrases repeated. Dates stopped appearing. He wrote of hands under the floor, of waking up and finding his candle relit when he knew it had burned out. He described prayers that didn't match any scripture he knew, voices teaching him words he could not remember after writing them. He scratched drawings into the stone, though none were found on the walls. He began marking time in scratches, 5 tallies per group. The number reached into the hundreds. Then, near the end, he stopped writing altogether for 5 pages. The last 3 entries returned with a trembling script. He wrote, "They won't let me leave." Then, I sealed it from inside. Then, finally, in the last full line, he wrote, "I thought I was coming to confront them, but they were waiting for me to join." No further entries followed. Forensics dated the journal paper and ink to the correct era. His handwriting, confirmed by multiple past letters and sermon drafts, was a match. The pages were real. The words were his. No one could explain how he'd ended up there. There was no indication he had carried food or water. No evidence of how long he had survived. But one thing was now undeniable. Father Bell had not disappeared. He had descended, on his own, and he had tried to wall himself in. The journal was removed for analysis. The room was left sealed once again. But now, for the first time in 31 years, there was a voice. And what it described, what it hinted still waited beneath the church, was only beginning to be understood. Once the journal was recovered from the sealed stone chamber, it was rushed under controlled conditions to the State Forensics Lab in Worcester. The document, despite the years underground, was astonishingly intact, mold-free, untouched by water or vermin. Analysts said it had likely survived because the room had been completely sealed, creating a stable, if lifeless, pocket of preservation. What investigators had in their hands wasn't just evidence. It was the first-hand account of a man who had vanished into myth. The first 6 pages were written in Father Bell's known hand, clean, purposeful cursive. The ink didn't bleed. The tone was composed. He opened with a simple entry. "I heard music coming from the wall." He described how, during midnight mass, he'd stepped away from the altar and gone into the side corridor to retrieve a cloth. That's when he heard what he believed was Gregorian chant, faint, hollow, and not coming from the choir loft. It was coming from behind the broom closet. He wrote that he believed it was a prank at first. Perhaps the boys were playing with a portable tape player. But when he opened the closet, the sound grew louder. He traced it to a wooden panel at the back, which he described as soft at the edges, almost lifted by breath. He found a gap. Behind it, a tunnel. The music deepened. "It wasn't a song," he wrote. The breath turned rhythmic. He lit a candle and followed. The next entry described descending into stone farther than he thought the building extended. He counted steps, 39, then 42. He said the air became very still, very fast. He described a moment where he turned to go back but couldn't see the exit, not from smoke, not from collapse. He simply could not see where he had come from. "It was gone behind me," he wrote, as if swallowed. He began referring to a presence, not as a hallucination, but as a fact, something that watches without lungs. He continued down the passage until he reached a chamber. He claimed to find a collapsed altar and a rusted crucifix fused into the wall. He said the candle flickered but didn't go out. He believed he'd discovered an early chapel, one predating St. Aurelius, possibly Puritan, possibly heretical. He camped there for the first night, writing that the walls seemed to absorb his prayers. He tried to sing hymns, but the sound fell flat. "There's no echo," he wrote. "Even God's voice would land like dust." By page 10, his tone had shifted. The sentences became shorter, less reasoned. He described hearing whispers, not like voices, but like memories trying to speak again. He said the floor grew warm at night. He said he tried to sleep, but the air pulsed under his skin. He believed the space had been used before, not for worship, but for penance. Not for sins committed, but for things allowed, he wrote. He mentioned trying to climb back up, but claimed the stairs no longer led up. Only down now. Always down. By the next few entries, the language degraded. Paragraphs broke apart. Dates vanished. He wrote about cold hands brushing his robe. He wrote about movement behind the walls. The stone isn't dead, he wrote. It breathes. He began speaking about them. At first, they were described vaguely. Shadows, sounds. But then came specifics. They wear the robes, he wrote, but their faces are holes. He described seeing outlines in the dark, not walking, but hovering near the corners of the chamber. They want to be remembered, he wrote, but they can't leave unless they're replaced. In the margins, he began scribbling what looked like fragments of prayer, partial Latin, half-formed psalms, sections of phrases that didn't exist in any scripture. Experts later analyzed them. None matched anything in the Vulgate or Roman Rite. Some appeared to blend Latin with Old French and pre-Reformation English. Linguists could not identify their origin. By page 23, his writing became frantic. The lines tilted sideways, some overlapped. He no longer used a candle. He described complete darkness. He said he had sealed the door from the inside to buy time, but then added, "They were already here before I closed it." He repeated one phrase multiple times near the end. "We let them in." The final full paragraph was almost unreadable. It contained the following: "They don't leave, they wait. We built on top of them, sang above them, married above them, forgave above them, but they never left. And when one listens, one joins." After that, just a few disjointed words, breathless, hollow hands. I hear them behind me now. The last page had only one line. The candle went out. Experts reviewing the journal said it read like a descent into isolation-induced psychosis, but others weren't so sure. The physical evidence didn't support delusion. The journal was real. The stairwell was real. So were the catacombs, and the altar, and the stole. Father Bell had not imagined his path into the underground. He had followed something. And he had stayed. The question now wasn't whether the journal was genuine. It was what he meant by them. Because whatever they were, they hadn't left. And what happened next would push the investigation beyond history into something older. Something buried, but never forgotten. As investigators pored over the journal, a second team, historians and archivists from the Massachusetts Historical Society, began tracing the origins of the church grounds. Their focus was no longer on Father Bell's disappearance in isolation. The entries in his journal, the age of the catacombs, and the remains found deep beneath the nave suggested that the truth stretched much farther back. The question now wasn't just how the priest had vanished. It was, what had he walked into, and who had been there before him? The earliest references to the site came from fragmented town records dating back to 1684. At the time, Ashevale was not yet formally incorporated. It existed only as a scattered settlement, referred to in some surviving documents as Lower East Haven. A handful of families had migrated inland from coastal Salem, bringing with them religious divisions that were already fracturing the colonies. Among them was a group of Puritan separatists who, according to surviving correspondences, rejected both the Anglican Church and the growing Congregationalist movement. They referred to themselves simply as the Keepers. The Keepers were noted for their strict codes of silence and their refusal to attend public worship. They built a chapel on a small hill just west of what would later become Ashevale's main square. It was constructed of rough timber and stone, with no bell tower, no signage, and no known records of sermons. Town rumors at the time labeled the group as darkly contemplative. One of the few surviving letters from a neighboring village accused the sect of burying what they should have burned. By 1693, colonial officials issued a formal investigation into the group after two young clergy assigned to monitor the chapel disappeared during a routine visit. Their names were John Hale and Thomas Varell, both in their early 20s, both newly trained from New Haven. Neither was ever seen again. The official inquiry stalled, citing poor terrain, lack of roads, and an atmosphere not conducive to cooperation. Within a year, the chapel burned to the ground under unexplained circumstances. No bodies were found. The hill remained vacant for over a century. Then, in 1831, the land was granted to the Diocese of Boston to establish a new church for the growing inland Catholic population. That church would become St. Aurelius. Its construction began in spring of that year and finished by the end of 1833. Interestingly, the builders noted at the time that the foundation had to be excavated twice, once for the chapel and again for a void discovered beneath the northeast wing. The documents didn't explain what the void was, only that it had been braced with additional stone, then sealed with blessing. That phrase, sealed with blessing, appeared in diocesan shorthand for situations where exorcism rites were considered but not formally recorded. Even more troubling was a handwritten notation in the diocesan construction log, initiated only with RG, which read, "This place remembers." The team also found references to a document now lost, the Asheville Ledger of Ordinance, which supposedly included warnings from 19th century clergy regarding passages that predate the faith. A partial copy of a sermon from 1864 mentioned the graves that shift and the corridors where no light holds. That same year, another priest reportedly resigned after citing a haunting rhythm in the stones. His name was Father Desmond Witt. He left Asheville for Nova Scotia and never returned. The more they searched, the clearer the pattern became. The catacombs had not been a mystery to everyone. They had simply been buried under centuries of silence, warnings softened into metaphor, records redacted or lost. The journal of Father Bell had not uncovered a secret. It had confirmed one. The language in his final entries, "They wait, we let them in," now carried historical weight. It was not the first time clergy had vanished on these grounds. It wasn't even the second. The chapel burned in 1693, the disappearances of Hale and Varell, the resignations in 1864, Father Bell in 1994. All of it tied back to one location, one building, one hill. The historians presented their findings to both law enforcement and the archdiocese. Officially, neither agency commented. Unofficially, a quiet internal review began. Funding for the restoration project was paused. A new barrier was ordered around the excavation site. Public tours of the church were suspended indefinitely. But the most haunting detail emerged last, found scrawled in the margin of a single 17th century letter archived in the Massachusetts colonial records. It read, "Do not rebuild what burned. Let the hill go cold. Let the voices stay buried." But they hadn't stayed buried, and with the excavation of that final sealed chamber still underway, it was becoming clear they had only been waiting. The journal alone could have ended the investigation. For many, it already had. The handwriting had been matched by two independent analysts. The ink composition, paper fibers, and binding materials dated precisely to the early 1990s. DNA pulled from the sweat-stained leather of the cover confirmed it belonged to Father Thomas Bell. It was definitive. The priest who vanished from midnight mass on December 24, 1994, had walked willingly into the hidden corridor beneath St. Aurelius and left behind a record of what he saw there, but not how he died, and not why his body was never found. That part came later. Roughly 3 weeks after the journal's discovery, as ground-penetrating radar continued to map the chambers beneath the church, a new void was detected, this one behind the sealed room where the journal had been found. The stone was thinner there, almost like it had been carved secondarily, with less precision. When the forensic team removed the back wall, they revealed a narrow crawl space, just wide enough to move through on hands and knees. It extended maybe 15 feet before ending abruptly in a dome-shaped cavity. Inside were 3 skeletal remains. Each one rested in a kneeling position, facing the back wall. Their bones were undisturbed, unscattered by time or wildlife. The air in the crawl space was bone dry, sealing the chamber like a tomb. Fragments of clerical robes still clung to their shoulders and backs, different fabrics, each degraded at varying rates. Forensic anthropologists would later confirm what investigators had only suspected. These men had not died together. They had died centuries apart. The first set of remains dated to the late 1600s. Bone density, dental wear, and burial conditions suggested a man in his 40s. The second, carbon dated to the early 1800s, had a healed fracture in the wrist and remnants of embroidered linen, consistent with priest vestments from the early American church. The third set, the most recent, dated squarely to the 20th century. Late 1900s. DNA testing is still pending, but the height, shoulder width, and age range match Father Bell almost exactly. The positioning of the bodies raised more questions than it answered. All three men had died kneeling. All had been facing the same wall. Not haphazardly, not collapsed, as if in prayer or obedience. No trauma was visible, no signs of violence, restraint, or defensive injury. They had not been forced there. They had knelt and never gotten up. Near the base of the wall they faced, half buried in stone dust and candle ash, was a flat slate tablet. It had no decorative carvings, no border, just a single Latin inscription, roughly etched into its surface with what looked like a crude blade. The translation was verified by two language experts and later reviewed by the Vatican archives. It read, "Qui intrat infra, locum sum accipit. He who enters below must take their place." That was the final piece, the journal, the bones, the inscription, all pointing to a truth that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or myth. The hidden church beneath St. Aurelius had never been abandoned. It had been waiting. Within 48 hours of the discovery, the diocese ordered the immediate closure of St. Aurelius. The remaining congregation, already diminished by decades of fear, received the news in silence. There was no protest, no press conference, just boarded doors, a chain across the gate, and a notice posted quietly on the rectory door. Temporarily closed for investigation. It has never reopened. Access to the site is now restricted. The stairwell has been resealed under reinforced concrete, and the lower chambers, including the crawl space, have been declared off-limits by federal order under historical protection and forensic preservation statutes. Officially, the case is closed. Father Bell is listed as deceased. His final moments are presumed to have occurred sometime between December 24th and December 29th, 1994, though the lack of decomposition in the sealed space makes exact time of death impossible to confirm. Unofficially, the town of Ashevale hasn't moved on. Locals report that on cold nights you can still hear faint echoes coming from beneath the hill. Not voices, not music, just a kind of low vibration, like humming beneath the earth. Some say it's nothing, the memory of a wound. Others say it's the sound of something still there. And Father Bell, who once stepped away from the altar and never returned, is no longer considered missing. He simply went where others had gone before him, and took his place.